We're about to start. Sorry, we're a couple of minutes late. I give you guys a chance to settle and find somewhere to sit. So welcome, my name's Andy Jarrett. I'm your host today for this Jersey's first DeFi Summit. First, a couple of bits of housekeeping. You've seen some QR codes kicking around. One, you can win a Lambo. It's a crypto conference, crypto event after all, but given it's a bear market, it's a Lego Lambo, but you know, who wouldn't want one of them anyway? The other QR code is a feedback form, so if you want some CDP and that's important to you, please fill it out. It's also feedback to us, and that's kind of important to us. But here's a top tip for you. If you fill out the feedback form that's on the QR code for the Lambo, you get 2 entries for the Lambo. So there you go. We've got a great lineup of speakers for you today. We've got Piers Ridyard, who is co-founder of Radix, and he's going to talk about decentralized finance, how that's come through, its convergence with finance. We've then got Alex Baitlin, who is the CEO of Bitpanda Custody, formerly Trustology, and he's going to talk about the evolution of custody into the decentralized finance space. And then we would have Sophie, who was going to talk about Web3 and identity, but she came back from Seville at the weekend with a nice tan and COVID for the 3rd time. So she wins the award in Radix for the number of times you can get if anybody's had COVID. So Piers has stepped up, and he's going to do that presentation for us. And then we've got a fabulous panel. Although that's also been hit by COVID. So Andrew was going to, Andrew from AIM Capital Markets, CEO, was going to give us industry perspective, but he's literally just dropped out. But we do have Amy Bryant, Deputy CEO of JFL, and Julie Kerr, who is Associate Director of Financial Services within the government. So we've also got Piers and Alex. So hopefully today you'll have lots of thought-provoking questions to ask our panel. But first of all, I kind of want to give you a bit of a history and sort of bring us up to today. In 2014, I led the cryptocurrency consultation and oversaw the implementation when I was working for Digital Jersey. And at that time, the thesis was that DeFi could do for capital what the internet had done for information. And kind of more importantly, I felt that robust, serious projects would seek jurisdictions that were serious financial players, that had crypto-friendly legislation, had agile frameworks for lawmaking because this space goes so fast, and a government that saw the strategic benefit of the space. And so back then, I took the then digital minister, Philip Ozef, to various fintech hotbeds, and he spoke at a number of crypto conferences. And so as we roll on now 5, 6 years, you can see that DeFi is happening. It's created products like flash loans that just aren't available in traditional finance. It's affecting what's going on in traditional finance in other ways. And Philip Ozef's back in politics. You mark my words next week. But that's not the most important thing. I think the most important things happened on the legislation side, and that was only very recently. So MiCA has been passed and it's into law, and what that does is it sets up the legislative framework for Europe for crypto. Hong Kong's getting its act together. The UK is firming its policy, and probably most significantly, there's a bipartisan bill in the US which moves the control or the oversight of crypto from the SEC into the Commodities and Trading Futures Commission. And so what you're going to see, if I liken it a bit to GDPR, you know, GDPR came in and basically the world, if they want to interact with GDPR, countries have got to follow that standard. And that's happening now in the crypto world, which is great for institutions because he's getting that regulation in place. I want to give you 4 examples of why I think this is highly relevant to Jersey today. And they're all from an event that we went to about 3 weeks ago called Consensus. It's the biggest event in the sort of crypto calendar. It used to be in New York, and it's outgrown New York. It was in Austin, Texas. And on the first day's talks, different tracks but talks, and then there's an exhibition. And on the first day, I was in a queue in the buffet at lunchtime with Piers. Don't know if you remember this. And it was huge. It was like at least 3 times as big as this room. And we spoke to a gentleman behind us, didn't have a clue who he was. And he was really interested in what we're doing. And so Piers, being Piers, never one to not take the opportunity to take somebody down the Radix rabbit hole, started talking about Radix. Well, about 20 minutes later, we arrived at the food, and the gentleman was still very interested in what Piers was saying. We got some food, and we went and sat down, and he followed us. So I said to him, look, we've talked to you quite a lot. Tell us about who you are and what you're doing. And he's the CEO of a large financial services firm. It was a US financial services firm. And what he said to me was, we've got over $1 trillion under management, and I've seen this before, the writing's on the wall. We're going to be disintermediated. Let that sink in. Over $1 trillion under management, and the writing's on the wall. And what he was there doing was trying to understand how he could adapt and remain relevant in this new world of DeFi. You've had a coffee and a croissant. Next, I went to watch this gentleman speak. Does anybody know who he is? His tie possibly gives it away. Gentleman at the back? Yeah, absolutely right. Christoph, can you give that gentleman a T-shirt? Radix Revelation. It is the Premier of Bermuda. And he spoke eloquently for about 45 minutes on their digital assets regime. He talked about mistakes they've made. He talked about lessons they've learned. He dropped the names of a whole host of companies working there. But then he said one thing really, really significant. And he said, for the first time in 21 years, we've licensed a bank. And it's a crypto bank. They take fiat and crypto payments. And I think that's really, really significant for Bermuda. This was our stand at Consensus. We were super busy for the time we were there, but that's not the reason for showing it you. To the right of our stand, you can see a white pop-up. I'll zoom in. So the Cayman Islands were there. They'd not spent much on branding. They arrived with 2 pop-up banners. But they were super busy for the time of the event. They have VASP legislation, by the way. And I saw polo shirts with at least 3 law firms in Jersey that were on that stand. So clearly the Cayman Islands are on board with DeFi and where that's going. And then lastly, and possibly the most significant, there was a gentleman walked onto our stand, and he had a logo on his T-shirt of a bank that everybody in this room would know. It's a global bank. And I had a chat to him, and he was deeply technical. And after 30 minutes or so, he said, look, Andy, I like what I'm hearing, but I'd really like to understand more. I'd like to get my hands dirty with it. And it turns out he works for Group, and he's the head of research. So I said, great, we'll organize a call in a couple of weeks' time, but we've got a party tomorrow. Come along, bring your friends, anybody you think that's relevant. And so he brought a gentleman. He said, Andy, you've got to speak to this guy. And it was the head of identity for MasterCard. Now, I'm not going to go into why the head of identity for MasterCard was there, because I think Piers is going to cover that when he fills in for Sophie later. But those are the sorts of people that were there. And to round that story out, we had a conversation with the head of research 2 weeks ago. And today, our head of product is flying to head office, and tomorrow morning he presents to their group board. And in the afternoon, he's got a deep dive with their research team. Now, I'm not telling you that because we're talking to a global bank. Kind of something may happen, something may not. Doesn't really matter. What matters is that the group board of a global bank is serious about this space. And so my question to all of you in the room is, are you serious? And if you are taking some inspiration from Darwin, what are you going to do to adapt? And if you're sat there thinking, I'm not sure, hopefully speakers will help you. So with that, I want to introduce Piers Ridyard, founder or co-founder of Radix, CEO of RDX Works, and also, probably won't like me telling this, Great Britain national former taekwondo champion.
No one's mentioned that for years. Jeez. All right. Hey, everyone. So, yes, my name is Piers Ridyard. I am the CEO of RDX Works, which is the core developer of the decentralized finance protocol Radix. Radix is a public ledger, a little bit like Ethereum or Bitcoin, but it's designed specifically for building decentralized finance. So the purpose of this presentation is to give everyone a little bit of a flavor about what DeFi actually means, and then to talk a little bit about what Radix is doing specifically. But there's going to be some level setting here, and I'm going to start with the basics and then move up from there. So first of all, high level about Radix. Radix is a company that is building towards a radically better financial system. And we believe that's possible because of the sea change in the technology that's occurred, in the same way that the internet made sharing information radically better. But to do that, we realize that we can't build all of those things ourselves. We are merely an enablement platform for other people's success. And so the way that we do that is by building tools to give builders everything they need to obsolete traditional finance. And the reason that I've put obsolete here is that I think it's an important one. The thing that that drives customers, consumers, businesses to use new technology is because it does something better that they already did. And that's fundamentally what we're talking about here. We're talking about a sea change in what can be done in how you build finance and how you service finance to individuals and companies. And that will ultimately, in our belief, obsolete what the current systems look like. And when that happens, we do believe that's going to benefit billions of people. The reason is that if you look at the financial access of our current financial system, it's only about a third of the global financial assets and a third of the global financial population that is actually able to access finance today in all of the ways that most of us in this room are able to access. But then there's a large amount of extra value that can be extracted in terms of better liquidity, in terms of better capital allocation, that will lead to better outcomes for the world as well. So I'm going to give you a little story. And the story starts in 1983. January the 1st, 1983. Does anyone know what happened on January the 1st, 1983? Hands up. And it was the birth of the internet. It was when the internet went live. And the NASDAQ was at 230, which will become important in a second. And then it was very interesting and exciting to a lot of geeks. But it wasn't really that interesting or exciting to many other people. However, these people understood that something had radically shifted in how you could make computers talk to each other. And that started to lead to greater and greater innovation. That culminated in a bull run of March 10th, 2000, which is when NASDAQ Composite Index hit 5,048. And this is generally called the dot-com bubble. And there were failures and there were successes. A lot of people talk about pets.com as an example of failure. But you know, at the same time, companies like Amazon also grew up during this era. And so there was a lot of excess capital that flowed into the market, a lot of belief in this future technology. And then that hit its low point, actually October 9th, 2002, not October 9th, 2022. October 9th, 2002, the NASDAQ index had fallen all the way to 1,114. This was the bottom of the bear market, and in that period from 2000 to 2002, $1.7 trillion of value was disappeared, essentially, from the stock market. And there was, you know, this was widely considered to be, at that point, if you go back and read some of the articles, and they are fascinating, people were saying it's the death of the internet. The internet was a stupid experiment. No one's going to use the internet. And you can see a lot of those things repeating at the moment in crypto. You can see a lot of people saying crypto was a stupid idea or that public ledgers are not going to be the future. the thing is that the internet didn't actually fail as an experiment. Some of the businesses that were built on top of it failed as experiments. But actually, if you go back and look at them, even the businesses that failed were not wrong. A lot of them were just early. Pets.com was created to be able to service people who had pets and they wanted to buy pet food and pet toys and all these kinds of things at home. That today is actually one of the fastest growing consumer areas in the online retail space, is stuff for pets. So they weren't wrong. They were just early. And a lot of these experiments are failed experiments that in the long run are showing us the patterns of how business is going to fundamentally change in the same way that happened at the start of the internet. And I think that we would all now look back and say, the bursting of the internet bubble didn't mean that bricks and mortar stores didn't need to worry, that they didn't need to fundamentally consider their web strategy. And I think the same is true around crypto. Web3 is going to be an inevitability, and I will try and give you guys some of the background as to what are the tool sets that are available to build with and why people are getting excited about it. So 20 years later, the internet is one of the single most important pieces of infrastructure in the world, and I think in 20 years we'll be talking in the same way about Web3 infrastructure. So let's start with a simple question. What is DeFi? I have my own definition of decentralized finance because I think that it's the one that is the most helpful. Finance built on decentralized infrastructure. Now, a lot of people think that for something to be decentralized finance, everything has to be decentralized. I don't think that's true at all. The reason that the infrastructure is important to be decentralized is the same reason that the internet itself is important to be decentralized. The internet was designed to withstand nuclear Armageddon. And it was designed to withstand nuclear Armageddon. Part of that anti-fragility is the decentralized nature of it. Any part of it can be destroyed, and you can still reroute any information across that network almost instantaneously. The same thing applies when you're thinking about global finance. And if you're thinking about somewhere that you want the assets of the entire world to be based, you have to think of something that is supranational, that is neutral, that is able to withstand massive attack and is able to withstand massive problems. And so this is why infrastructure is so important to be decentralized and why a lot of the crypto industry really does obsess about decentralization. There's also a second part of this that is really important, which is that you get essentially immediate compatibility between applications built on top of it. So if I have a computer and I connect to the internet, I can connect to any server that is on the internet. And the reason for that is that there is a framework for that communication. On a public ledger, if you create an asset, that asset is then instantly accessible or usable in any application that wants to use that asset on that platform. And it's the fact that global finance is interconnected and that capital needs to move instantaneously between those opportunities, that a public ledger, which is highly threat resistant and able to allow capital to move instantaneously between these opportunities, is going to win over private ledgers where the activation energy is very high. You have to go and ask permission to go and use them. So right now, this battle is, I think, one of the bigger battles that is going on, and we're seeing governments come in and try and build their own versions of it as well, with things like the Chinese blockchain platforms, as well as America looking like they're going to do it. That also happened in the ages of the internet. Those who remember France and Telnet will remember that France tried to build their own version of the internet, but ultimately the internet won overall because it was neutral ground. If we think that it's difficult to make companies cooperate, think how difficult it's going to be to make countries cooperate around standards. So, where have we come from? I think the starting point of this and why we think that there is some fundamental problems with how finance is built today comes basically from how finance started. We started with barter economies, and then we quickly, in about 400 years ago, we started to move to fiat or money-based economies, where the money was actually backed by physical assets like gold. And this allowed you to go and trade, go and buy and sell in marketplaces. However, human ambition quickly exceeded just the want to buy locally, and suddenly you needed to be able to trade across nations. And so what happened is the establishment of banks. And banks were trusted intermediaries where you could deposit something in one country and then withdraw it in another. This allowed settlement, lending, exchange, and investment. And it was all based on the trust of those institutions, because those institutions was physically where the money was custodied. And so this started what now still looks like the basis of our financial system. Institutions that are trusted to hold monetary objects on behalf of clients. Now that feels sort of weird in the internet age, because what we're used to is this idea of basically anyone being able to connect with anyone. That it is a competitive, convenient, inclusive, and cheap network that anyone can come along to, set up shop, and try and persuade people to come and use their website or their services. Whereas that's not really true in finance today. DeFi, the purpose of these public networks is to combine these two visions. You have this ability to have an open platform where anyone can come along and build in a competitive marketplace for capital and users. And it can provide a safe way of holding assets that removes large proportions of institutional trust that currently is necessary. Now, when I say large proportions, I'm not going to say everything, because I will talk about where I think institutional trust is still massively important in the system. But it changes the trust dynamic, and I will be talking about how shortly. So let's talk about the superpowers. The first superpower here is the idea of a token. And a token is both a very simple and a very complicated object. Everyone here has heard of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a token. Everyone here has probably heard of Ethereum. Ethereum is a token, but you can create a token that can represent anything. You can create a token that represents equity, that represents debt, that represents commodities, that represents the ability to access a gym, the ability to be able to own intellectual property. A token is merely a way of going, this represents something. And this thing on ledger, when I pass it, the ownership should also pass with it. And the list is to help you understand that tokenization essentially applies to any object that you would want to own or any right that you would want to own. That's the first superpower, the ability to create objects that can natively be transferred and handled on top of these public networks. The next superpower is what is called dApps, decentralized applications or smart contracts. This is one of the harder things to sort of completely understand the implications of. It's a simple thing to say, but it's a hard thing to completely understand the implication of. A dApp, or decentralized application or a smart contract, is a piece of code that runs on top of the public ledger. It doesn't run on a separate server. It is actually part of the running code of the ledger, which means that it runs according to the consensus and the security of that system. And importantly, it can hold assets itself. So if you've tokenized something, that smart contract, according to its own internal logic, can decide what happens to those assets inside it. And that's a really critical idea, because now you've removed the concept of an intermediary who is holding something. The intermediary actually becomes the contract itself, becomes the computer program itself. And the computer program can be defined to be anything. You know, if you want to make it a regulatory compliant computer program, you can do that. The regulatory rules can be defined in the logic of the code. If you want it to be a market that is 24/7 and operates according to internal logics, that anyone who turns up can give one token and get another token, you can do that too. Essentially, anything you can imagine and then write down as an architecture you can build that can then directly manage tokens within that program. And that is the basis for how you can get rid of a huge amount of the institutional trust. It's necessary. Let's take an example, right? So imagine that you have a currency exchange, right? And that I have some tokenized Apple tokens, and I want to be able to purchase some tokenized bonds. I can have a smart contract that I can go to and send in my tokenized Apple tokens, and then the tokenized bonds will come out the other side at the prevailing exchange rate. Now, that doesn't need an actual exchange. It just needs a few lines. Actually, what I'm describing here already exists in the form of an application called Uniswap that has done over $10 billion of daily volume at its peak, and today, in the last 24 hours, did $1 billion of volume. And that is a smart contract that is less than 10,000 lines of code, or around 10,000 lines of code, and it was built by 2 people. And there is no financial institution. All it is a piece of internally referencing logic and the ability to trade cryptocurrencies. And it is just cryptocurrencies right now. Like, they haven't moved to the point that they are getting real-world assets or tokenized commodities or anything like that. But that will happen. The next superpower is this idea of composability. So I have one smart contract, and this is what I was referring to before, and why these platforms are going to be so powerful. I have one smart contract. Let's say it's an exchanging smart contract. And then I have another smart contract built by a different company, by a different set of people, and these 2 smart contracts can work together. Let's say this second smart contract is a borrowing and lending smart contract. So let's say that I own $1 billion worth of Apple stock, and I see a short-term trade that I want to take on one of these exchanges where I want to buy Tesla and then sell it in a couple of weeks. However, I don't want to sell my Apple stock. So what I do is I go to a lending market, I deposit my Apple stock as collateral, I borrow $500 million from it, I take that onto the exchange, I sell my dollars, my tokenized dollars, and I buy my tokenized Tesla stock. And then 2 weeks later, I sell it, take out the money, pay back my loan, and get back my Apple stock. Now, what I've just described with everyday assets, again, already happens. There is over $10 billion of assets within a lending market called Aave that exists on top of Ethereum. And what you can do now is the lending market, Aave, didn't build the exchange, but it instantly works with the exchange. There was no APIs that they had to integrate. It just allowed the assets could be passed instantaneously for instantaneous settlement. Not only that, here's the really cool thing. If the lending market, let's say that Apple stock plummets, and now you have a collateral call moment, the smart contract itself is able to take those assets and sell it on the decentralized exchange and zero out the loan immediately itself. It doesn't actually need any intermediaries to step in. It can just do it according to the internal logic of the system. And again, this is happening today. That has happened through 2 crypto crashes. And these smart contracts, things like Aave, things like Uniswap, none of them have had an event where the capital that it holds has been less than the debts that it owes. And that's through some pretty volatile crypto trading. I mean, crypto is a lot more volatile than it is than things like stocks and shares. So this idea of composability, this idea that you can stitch together many different applications built by different companies, is the third superpower of these platforms. And you can think of this as like a full unbundling, right? A full unbundling of services. Previously, if you wanted to do this, you had to be a bulge bracket investment bank, or you had to build some pretty complicated financial arrangements with each other. Now, all of those things are just instantly accessible via smart contracts. And then the fourth superpower, the thing that I think a lot of the financial markets missing now, like I hear JP Morgan, I hear Goldman Sachs talking about tokenization of real estate and things like that. That's awesome. But it doesn't get to the point that you have a liquid market. Liquidity is actually the king here rather than tokenization of assets. Tokenization of assets is fine, but if no one wants to buy them, then what's the point? Now, what DeFi has worked out is how you can bootstrap liquid markets by creating 2-sided marketplaces. So taking the example of Aave again, and me with my Apple stock that borrowed $500 million, $500 million worth of dollar-backed tokens, where did those dollar-backed tokens come from? Well, with Aave, what happens is there's a lending rate and a borrow rate. And the lending rate is determined by how many people are actually depositing dollar tokens onto the platform. So anyone can come along, they've got some dollar tokens, and they see the yield, and they go, ooh, 8% per annum. That looks great. They put their dollars in there. And then someone else comes along and goes, oh, I'm happy to borrow at 8.5% per annum. I will deposit some collateral and I'll borrow out of it. And the more that people borrow and the less available dollars there are, the higher the lending rate goes. And the less people borrow and the more people put in dollars, the lower the borrowing rate goes. And you end up with this two-sided marketplace of liquidity where you have people who have capital who want to get a yield on it, and you have people who need to access that liquidity to be able to do something else with the self-governing nature of the ability to zero out debts when they're coming too close to their margin, etc. And again, I'm not describing things that are pie in the sky. I'm describing things that represent billions of dollars of activity on top of public ledgers right now today, but just within the crypto market. So what you end up with is this ability to do settlement, lending, exchange, and investment all via smart contracts, all via public ledgers, all via this interface that allows assets and users to move seamlessly between any of these applications and capital to essentially flow to where the best opportunities are. Now, obviously, on top of that, you can build programmatic algorithms that can go and seek out the best alpha within this ecosystem and then move it instantaneously between those opportunities. That's already happening as well. It's called yield farming. And so right now, the whole tokenization game has mainly been within the realm of cryptocurrencies and crypto assets, things like NFTs, things like in-game virtual assets. But there is no reason that all of this learning can't be applied and won't be applied to the global financial system and real-world assets. So this is a slide that Andy showed before, which is showing finance today, trusted institutions where the institutions are responsible for holding assets, and then where we're going with DeFi, which is smart contracts which are natively able to handle assets directly, and a massive reduction in the realm in which institutional trust is necessary. Again, it doesn't go away completely, and I will be talking about that as well. So this is where we are today, right? $100 billion in DeFi. Give or take. 10x from there is $10 trillion, and the global financial system is $400 trillion. Right? So right now, despite all of the activity I've spoken about, despite all of the exciting billions of dollars that is flowing through crypto, we're pretty early. So I'm showing you this slide because I think it's important that the race is just starting. And I think there is now a roadmap for us to start understanding where this is going to start to be applied to regulated finance. And there is going to be a race for that. There's going to be a race for the regulated jurisdictions that are going to support that natively. There's going to be a race for the legal frameworks that are available, the service providers that are available, and the ability to tokenize these assets. And if you are a financial service provider who does things like securitization, that does things like custody or trust, all of those things are going to be incredibly important, because how else are these assets that currently exist in the real world going to be represented on public ledgers? There is still the requirement for trust, and there is still the requirement for legal, regulatory, and service providers to be able to take everything that currently exists in the global financial system today and reapply it to what is going to exist in DeFi tomorrow. But there are many jurisdictions that are fighting for this. So obviously, Radix is aiming to be the platform that this is built on top of. But I really hope that we can work together to make Jersey the jurisdiction that most of this activity happens as well. So my second part, I know it says part 4, but my second part in my own head of the presentation is going to be going through a little bit about, this is all cool, but here's some things that you should know if you're thinking about going into crypto about the problems that currently exist with the space and a bit about what Radix is doing to solve them. So one of the biggest problems that people often talk about today about crypto is scalability. You hear a lot of people complaining about scalability. If you use Ethereum, it's incredibly expensive to use the network because too many people want to use it and it's not scalable enough. And you can also see that in things like Solana and Avalanche and other platforms that have recently launched. What we've actually found is that's not quite correct. The scalability problem, the cost of using these platforms versus the opportunity that is represented on these platforms has not stopped over $220 billion of capital flowing in a 2-year period. It went from $1 billion under management to $220 billion under management. Now in the bear market, we're back to $100 billion, but that's better than $1 billion. And so the big problems that we actually see is that right now it sucks to be a developer. There have been over $2 billion worth of hacks in DeFi in the last 6 months. $2 billion worth of hacks in the last 6 months. And that is really stressful and difficult for developers. It's really difficult to build effectively in this space because you're constantly worrying about what might happen to your code security. It sucks to be an entrepreneur because it costs millions of dollars to get code audits. It costs millions of dollars to hire these developers because there is a tiny number of developers. And it sucks for users because you end up with high fees, confusing transactions, and very high transaction times. So we're still early in the technology space as well. Like Ethereum, everything I'm describing here is today's dominant platform, Ethereum's problems, as well as most of the other platforms as well. So you can think of this as like Usenet era, those who were around when Usenet was around, of the internet. But the number one problem of DeFi that we have found from speaking to over 1,000 DeFi developers in the last 2 years is that the developer experience sucks. And it sucks because the tools that were built, people didn't know that DeFi was going to be the future. When Solidity was built, when the EVM was built, when all of these tools that people are using to build DeFi was built, people didn't know that decentralized finance and this ability to create exchanging and trading and borrowing and settling and tokenization was actually going to be the future. They just thought, oh, it's going to be this decentralized world computer. It could do anything. But that means it sort of does everything a bit badly. And as a result of that, 90% of a DeFi's developer's time is actually not spent on developing, it's spent on security. And you can understand why security would be important if you're moving the institutional trust framework from the concept of an institution holding something to the concept of a smart contract holding something. If that smart contract has bugs, has problems, then the funds can disappear very quickly. This is how a decentralized exchange should work. So this is how we imagine it. This is how you would draw it. I put tokens in, it does some calculations, it puts those tokens into one bucket, and then it pulls some other tokens out of another bucket and puts it back into the trader's account. This is how it actually currently works in DeFi today. You end up with a very complicated set of different mini programs that are all speaking to each other that don't understand that they are talking about assets. They just think that they are passing messages around. And a lot of this ends up with the hacks that we see. The most popular one is something called reentrancy or recursion, where you end up having the ability to continually call a function within a smart contract that allows you essentially to drain funds from it. And that, again, happens because these smart contracts don't understand what assets are. They don't understand what tokens are. They don't have the language of finance directly built into them. So we've seen 220x in DeFi capital, but we've only seen 2x in developer growth. And there is actually currently only 18,500 Web3 developers that are working full-time in Web3 today, which is pretty tiny if you compare it to everything else. We have 27 million developers in the world today, and only 18,500 of them are working in Web3. And that's the biggest problem. Like every project we speak to and go, what's your biggest problem? It's not capital, it's not liquidity, it's how do we get enough talent to be able to build Web3. So we've seen that DeFi is growing, but it's not thriving. A lot of the time, it's being stopped by this simple fact of it's really hard to build, lots of hacks can happen, and as a result, it's really hard to get developers. So what is it going to take to make DeFi explode? What is the next step in technology that is required for people to actually be able to build in this space? And the answer for us is to revolutionize the developer experience. Because if you can't build, think of what JavaScript did for the web industry. Think of how important the Netscape Navigator moment was. You needed those fundamental tools, and they don't currently exist. So how do you do that? The way that you do that is very similar to what happened in the game industry in the 1990s. So the computer game industry started in the 1990s, and there were these prodigious developers like John Cormack who created Doom. And he was what I call a god-tier developer. And a god-tier developer is someone who can do something that no one else in the industry can do. He built everything. He did the rendering engines, he did the physics engines, he did all the low-level implementation, and then he also built the game. And the reason that's hard is because it's actually really hard to make a computer game understand what physics is and how physics should work. And so you end up spending huge amounts of time, or the developers ended up spending about 90% of their time defining what the laws of physics were and how a world should work before they even started to build storylines. And it's the storylines that make it immersive. It's the storylines that make it fun for users to come and play. And one of the reasons that Doom was considered to be such an interesting thing, because it was a fun story and it was a good game, very much compared to what was around at the time. And the thing that changed everything was the games engine. So before the games engine came along, 90% of developer time was spent on things that were not building the game, but making the game actually work. And then Unity and the Unreal Engine came along, and they gave all of the stuff that was necessary to build a game for free. They said, look, here's the language of gaming. Here's a game engine. Here's physics. Here's all of the things that you need for rendering. And suddenly, 90% of the developer time could be built on the game, rather than 90% trying to define how a game worked. The result of that was the games industry went from a cottage industry to something that was bigger than music, movies, TV combined. So today, it is a $173 billion industry, and that essentially is what the games engine did for the games industry. So what will radically change the DeFi developer experience? Our belief is it's much the same thing, a programmable DeFi engine that will do for DeFi what the game engine did for gaming. And that's what we've built. We built something called the Radix engine, which gives all of the fundamental functionality of decentralized finance into the ledger itself, and then a really easy programming language called Scripto that allows you to then treat all of these objects as native objects of the ledger. You're no longer having to define what a token is, what a swap is, what a safe asset transfer is, what the idea of a liquidity pool is. All of those things are just given by the underlying engine. And not only do you get simplicity, you get a huge amount of security as well. So you end up not only allowing people to build much faster, you also allow people to build in a much safer way because the language is built around the idea that DeFi is the future, and we have enough evidence of what that looks like to be able to define a language sufficiently well to build something that we can say is secure, safe, and fast to build with. And then on top of that, what you have to, or underneath that, depending on how you look at the stack, you need to have a public ledger that is sufficiently scalable for decentralized finance. Scalability is something that is talked about a lot in the space, and this is something that can only occur when you've actually built the platform for the purpose that it serves. So, for example, if you look at something like Solana, which has says 65,000 transactions per second as the headline, its actual DeFi performance, if you try and do Uniswap swaps per second on it, ends up only being 273. It only gets about 0.5% of the performance of the headline of the network through to the underlying, to DeFi performance. Whereas things like Radix, because we built our consensus, again, around this idea of the main function of this ledger is finance, and the main function of finance is trading and settlement, then all of that performance that you get in the headline basically goes through right down to the throughput of the ledger as well. This is why we call it the full stack for DeFi, the only smart contract platform intentionally built to obsolete traditional finance. And the early developer reaction has been pretty great as well. So we're still in early testing phases. The programming language went live, but it's not live on the public network. We're still 6 months into testing. We have another 6 months of testing before we integrate it. But we've seen some pretty great feedback already. So I'm actually going to close out this part of the presentation and just talk about the last bit. This doesn't move very quickly. Give me 2 seconds. So what is still needed? What we've talked about has been the idea of what the superpowers are. So this idea of tokenization, this idea of smart contracts, this idea of smart contracts being able to natively hold assets, this idea of composability between smart contracts where assets can be passed seamlessly, and the idea of being able to bootstrap liquidity from the market directly by creating two-sided marketplaces of capital providers and users of that liquidity. But there's still a lot of things that need to happen. One of the big things is getting real-world assets on top of ledgers to then work within a DeFi way, to then be able to work within those smart contracts, create liquidity around these asset classes that already have large liquid markets outside of these public ledgers, but would be starting again from scratch within these public ledgers. And to do that, there's a couple of big questions. And I would say we have 2 great speakers, but one of the other speakers is me. So we'll say we have one amazing speaker, Alex, and then unfortunately Sophie won't be talking, so I'll be talking. But fundamentally, institutional custody of tokens is going to be a key component of making sure that we can bring institutional capital and institutional users into the space. Because as soon as you have these assets where they are at least semi-bearer instruments, now they don't have to be, you can obviously create whatever rule set you want to around who's allowed to own them and whatever transfer rules you want to apply. But at the end of the day, if you lose your tokens, you actually lose access to the underlying asset unless you decide to build it in a different way. Now, that means that the tokens are really important to be held securely and safely. So we're going to have someone talk about the importance of institutional custody and how institutional custody is emerging for the space so that you, as a financial services company, as a fund manager, as a hedge fund, can actually start thinking about allocating capital in the space, because the next question is going to be, cool, we want to buy these things, how do we safely hold them? And then the other thing that I haven't spoken about at all is AML KYC. To be able to bring institutional funds into the space, there is going to need to be a serious think about what the framework for AML KYC is going to look like in Web3, so that you don't break composability, so that you don't break this ability for people to provide liquidity to pools and for assets to move seamlessly between different applications built by different people. And just saying that, you'll start to see some of the problems that may emerge from that and why this is going to be one of the main areas that regulatory frameworks that are DeFi native are going to start to need to be thought about as well. So I hope that was helpful. I will leave you with the thought that I started with here, which is that the internet was a revolution in decentralized networks that changed the world. And we overestimated its effect in the short term and then underestimated its effect in the long term, especially after the crash. People were like, we don't need a web strategy. The web's stupid. I think the same thing is happening with decentralized networks again. And I think that Web3 strategy is going to be a critical component of any business that wants to make sure that they thrive in the next 20 years rather than get obsoleted. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Piers. We're going to take a quick 10-minute break, so grab a water, coffee, croissant, and then we'll get into the second half. talking about politics and Philip Ozef, Boris Johnson's resigned. So if you didn't get that, bye-bye, Boris. Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce Alex, the CEO of Bitpanda, and he's going to be on our panel, but he's going to take you through the custody in traditional finance and where it's moving to in crypto. Thank you.
Thank you so much and good morning. I think technically he's resigned as the Tory leader, but still wants to be the Prime Minister. There we go. Hi, I'm Alex. Thank you so much for your time. I always kind of really appreciate when people take the time to learn about kind of crypto. Your time is precious, so thank you for that. And my first time in Jersey, brilliant place. I was driving through this going, it's a bit like the Mediterranean. Unfortunately, I have to fly out tonight, but I'm told the weather is going to be superb for the next week, so enjoy it. I'm not jealous at all, but yeah. So hi guys, just who am I? I head up Bitpanda Custody, which was recently acquired by Bitpanda about February. Prior to that, I was the founder and CEO of Trustology. Trustology, now Bitpanda Custody, is a custodian wallet provider for institutionals needing crypto custody. So we're an institutional crypto custodian. We're FCA registered, we're insured, and we work with a bunch of customers from service providers like exchanges and brokers through to institutional investors like DeFi yield funds and token issuers. So it's a great pleasure to work with real thought leaders in this space like Piers and the Radix protocol and the entire team. So thank you for being invited to talk about that. So prior to that, my background is very much technologist by heart. I love tech and kind of ended up being in banking, which is cool too, and then ended up kind of. Then went from JP Morgan, Nomura, UBS, ended up running the UBS as an innovation function where I looked at all sorts of stuff from machine learning through to mobility security and then onto crypto, and I fell in love. It kind of combined all the things that I love the most: technology, kind of game theory, economics. It was very, very cool. Got hooked on that. Got to know some brilliant people like Joe Lubin and Vitalik Buterin from the Ethereum community. So did a lot of work there. Ended up setting up a number of consortiums, including utility settlement coin called Finality, and then ended up working in BNY Mellon, trying to figure out how to do crypto custody for them. And after a year, I figured out I'll be talking for the rest of my life and not doing much. So so I kind of became an entrepreneur, or tried to be one. Set up Trustology, focused on initially tech. We wanted to build the tech to give to banks, and the banks weren't buying. So I said, hell with it. I'm going to become the custodian. Gosh. Little did I know. Spun up the service, got FCA registered, got insured, got customers, got bought out. Why is that important? I kind of understand both sides. I got through the banking side. I learned what's important there, and then I looked at the crypto side. So hopefully I have a little bit of credibility to talk to you guys about this, and hopefully maybe useful to you. Before I continue, very interesting. Piers was talking about resiliency, and just two examples came up in my mind. Lloyd's TSB, I believe, a few years ago, ran out of computing power. It all went down. And there were stories in the news that children could not get their milk because their parents couldn't pay for milk. So, because the banks were down. So if you kind of think resiliency is not that important, it can actually be really, really important. And single points of failure in centralized systems are sometimes life-threatening. The other kind of moment I remember about resiliency, I was in Davos a few years ago, I think it was 2018, and there was a Ukrainian house. And really sadly, they were talking about the risk of invasion, even back then. And one of the points they talked about is that they wanted to put their land registry on the blockchain because they were afraid of being invaded. And apparently the very first thing that invaders do is they destroy public records, because it's very difficult to then reestablish who owns what once those records are being destroyed. In fact, so difficult that even today, a large percentage of property in Poland is disputed after the Nazi invasion. Unfortunately, their fears have come true, and we're seeing the atrocities that are happening there. But the point is, I think people understand the value of resiliency, and one of the best ways we've found to achieve resiliency through decentralization, or at least the best one we've found so far. So keep that in mind as we go through this, because there's a lot of rhetoric and, frankly, a bit of bullshit on crypto and false promises. But underlying that, I think there's a fundamental value that we need to be aware of. Putting aside the resiliency, this was not coordinated with peers. But I fundamentally look at what's really important when you're dealing with financial services, and that's liquidity. Awesome. Cool. So liquidity is key. Deep liquidity that's cheap is really, really important, because if there is no liquidity, we can't kind of interact financially, and we don't have opportunities for wealth creation. There's a pretty solid statistical correlation between high level of trust in an economy to lower costs of transacting to higher GDP. And there's consistent kind of correlation there. So it's really, really important that we have healthy, deep, cheap liquidity. What's a prerequisite to that? Trust. It's a big thing recently, of course. But trust is really important. You need to trust that, because if I don't trust that, I'm not going to put my money there. And if I don't put my money there, there's no liquidity. And if there's no liquidity, there is no financial activity. And we just sit there and fish and don't do anything else and hope for the good weather. So trust is really important. How do we build trust? Transparency is one of the key things for me. That's my hypothesis. And look, these are simplified models. I'm giving you stuff that hopefully is somewhat instinctively recognizable. It's oversimplified like any model is. There's a lot of nuance. I'm talking about here a trajectory rather than, you know, something that's absolutely solid. So transparency is one of the key, for me, requirements for building trust, because without transparency, sometimes you get good actors and sometimes you get bad actors. But unfortunately, pretty much always there will be some bad actors. And when they go bad, they go real bad. And then the entire trust gets demolished. So transparency is really important. And we've recognized that. We've brought in a bunch of regulators today. We'll be joining them very shortly, to supervise, because we recognize that, frankly, when there's so much money on the table, it's too tempting not to be dishonest. And therefore, we kind of have regulators who check stuff. Problem there is it's point-in-time checks. It's not like every transaction. And still, kind of, supervisors are usually underfunded, and they can only do that much. So you're going to have surface sea audits, surface sea regulation, and often, frankly, the real big ones always get missed, because the real big ones are new problems, new threats, which are very hard to recognize, and you only recognize them post-event. So what's the alternative way to the current model of ensuring transparency? And actually, decentralization is one of those. May prove to be not to be correct, but so far, this experiment is doing well. Because with decentralization, you're basically opening the books. You're showing to everyone every transaction you do. And everyone can verify the transaction. So when the light shines, it's much harder to do bad things, because so many more people participate and basically check. It's almost like having a regulator check every transaction that goes through the system. It's pretty amazing. Economically, that was not feasible before technology. We had to digitize everything to make it cheap enough to allow 10,000 nodes to verify every transaction. But we achieved that now. We can now have 10,000 people, and the reason I say that is about 10,000 nodes on Bitcoin varies, doing validation of every transaction. It was infeasibly expensive before. With technology, we made it cheap enough to have this level of resiliency and trust. Just never been possible before. That's the real revolution of technology. Why do I have those three above? Celsius, BlockFi, and 3AC. if you don't know crypto, probably won't mean much to you, but they're lenders and funds. They work in crypto space, but they're all kind of centralized lenders. Although they work with decentralized assets, the way they operate is centralized. All of them gone pop in the latest round. Why? Because frankly, they were black box. They were tempted by greed. They over-leveraged themselves. They did kind of things that weren't clear to everybody else, and now they're gone. Maker, Aave, we talked about Aave, decentralized protocols. Every single transaction is subject to rules enforced by smart contracts, enforced by 10,000 plus miners. Very hard to cheat. They're still here, and they're doing well. So a lot of people called me, and they went, the latest kind of crypto winter is really bad. I'm like, yeah, of course it sucks. But actually, it reaffirms my belief that decentralization is going to be something that's critical for much better trust and liquidity in the system. So my prediction, and don't listen to me because I get more things wrong than right, is that actually when DeFi really takes off, we'll have deeper and cheaper liquidity, which will create a spiral effect. The bigger the trade you want to do, you'll have to go to DeFi because it's got deeper liquidity. And that will attract more and more capital over time. So that 100x, that 400 trillion, I think within 10 years, we will be able to achieve that. Sounds really weird right now, but who would have thought 20 years ago that all of our shopping will be done on on Amazon? Okay, so this is slightly rehashing what Piers was saying, but again, I just want you to start thinking about under the hood what's happening. Traditional transactions, you have people on both sides, frankly, using banks. What do banks nowadays do? They're basically keepers of database, database records. That's what they do. They have the authoritative record in a database of who owns what. And because kind of different banks record different people's and organizations' ownership, when you move money around, you need someone to synchronize those. So payment service providers and a bunch of other people sit on top of that, and they effectively act as synchronization engines between databases. Yeah. I look at it as a technologist, so a payment service provider is just a syncing engine between two databases, as far as I'm concerned. I know it's more complex than that, but okay, and then other services sit on top, exchange services, you've got lending, borrowing, and all that kind of stuff, but they all ultimately rely, nowadays, more and more on synchronization of databases. And how does that work under the hood? Well, each organization has its database, which they don't share with anybody. It's a black box, and they also have some software running on servers. And that software enforces the rules by which you're allowed to change the data in a database. Yeah? If you're going to be moving around money, you need to debit and credit balances. Simple business logic, it gets much more complicated when you do DVP, PVP, but ultimately it is a bit of code that determines what is allowed to change. Okay, so data sits in a database, you have separate business logic, all of that is black box, and then customers interact with that black box through web UIs or whatever, and then regulators have a quick look at the black box and hope to spot problems. But of course, if someone is lying, it's really hard to detect any problems there, frankly. Okay, so again, to recap, traditional custody then moves from originally, again, simplifying gold bars and vaults to really keeping databases in data centers secure. That's been the mind shift in the last 50, 60 years. So we've changed the way we transact, all electronic, therefore much of custody has now shifted to effectively keeping electronic records. There are many, many exceptions, of course. Many jurisdictions still require can allow dematerialization, or indeed, you put the paper record somewhere, you create a digital token of that on a blockchain, not blockchain, normal database and move on. But ultimately, it is about record keeping. So DeFi, and when I say DeFi, it's all the applications, as well as tokens in form of code and data on a decentralized ledger. How does it work? Again, quick reminder, basically still got a database, yeah? But again, like Piers said, the database now contains not just the record of data, the balances on the ledgers, but the code that says what's allowed, how do you change that, what's permissible to change on that database. So again, if you want to move some money around from one account to another, the business logic is pretty simple. Debit one, credit the other, and then you have access checks. Is this person allowed to make them move the money? And that's all code. It's all bundled now together, and then each database is synchronized with potentially millions of other identical databases. In fact, anyone can have their own database and have synchronization, which means everyone can examine the code and everyone can examine the data, and everyone basically performs the same checks on the same transactions to make sure no one's cheating. Pretty awesome. So, and then how do we practically transact? Well, I won't ask you to strain your eyes too much. Basically, it looks like a web browser, yeah? Just like shopping has gone from walking into a shop to opening a browser, going to a website and buying stuff, finance is going the same way. You have websites. Those websites like Uniswap we talked about, they actually kind of, when you go on the website, that is the user interface of the application. JavaScript code is downloaded into your web browser and allows you to view your balances on the blockchain and create new transactions. Then when you want to do something, you press sign button. And then with a special browser extension called MetaMask, there are other solutions, just the most popular one. You then sign that transaction with what's called the private key to authenticate yourself. And then you, that kind of application submits the transaction to blockchain node database. And then all those nodes synchronize themselves automatically. So that's what really happens on the hood. It's all a bit of code, and you send transactions signed digitally to it. So all of a sudden, do you remember we talked about composability? That's really important because all of a sudden, you're no longer thinking of traditional custody as something where you take your assets, and if you want to do anything with them, I give you back to them, and you do something else. This is completely different now. What we're really looking at now is saying, I'm going to store, and this is what we really do. We store private keys on behalf of our customers, and then we proxy all of their transactions and check that the rules are satisfied. And if they're satisfied, we then sign the transaction with the key and our custody and place it on the blockchain for them. And then magic happens. So we are really kind of looking after keys, and we're doing transaction verification on behalf of our customers. And we talk about institutional DeFi versus kind of institution custody versus normal custody and whatever. All this means is that kind of the whole crypto movement started off with individuals, peer-to-peer. So if you're an individual, there's no need for authorizations and approvals. You get to keep the key, and therefore, actually, you can do this on a hardware dongle, yeah? And it's easy. It's your money. It's symmetric risk. If you've got 10 million in assets in a hardware wallet around your neck, you've got a 10 million bounty on you for your life, but you can also buy a yacht for 10 million and enjoy life. So there's symmetric risk and reward. If you're an asset manager holding 10 million around your neck, there's still a 10 million bounty on your life, but you only got potentially 100 grand or whatever it is your salary is as reward for taking that risk. Frankly, anyone who's willing to take that risk, I wouldn't give a penny to them to manage for me. So as soon as you're managing money on behalf of someone else, it's not your money. So really, most people wish to transfer that risk to a custodian who's paid to take that risk and secure it and back up the keys. And then, of course, you're now working across multiple people having to agree on transactions. So what was a single user experience, think of it as a personal email box. Now you need to have multi-user functionality so that somebody can submit the transactions, other can inspect it, verify it, approve it, and only then should the transaction be placed in the blockchain. And that's what we do. We've effectively kind of create a multi-user environment for people to be able to kind of manage their keys and sign transactions. So as a crypto custodian, we're now really not keeping records anymore because that's kept by everyone. Anyone who's got a database, the miners, are keeping those records. We no longer are the single authority on the records. But what we do keep is private keys, as well as we enforce the rules for kind of who's allowed to perform which transaction. And of course, we do compliance checks and so on, which is our other obligation under the 5th ML directive to the various different jurisdictions. So just like shopping has moved from physically walking into a shop to using your browser to buy stuff, so is finance shifting with DeFi. The experiment is still open. We don't know if it'll play out or not, but it's shifting to using your web browser to effectively transact with financial services. But those financial services are no longer organizations of people. They're smart contracts on blockchain. Now, of course, people who go, those smart contracts do not miraculously appear out of thin air. They were written at one point by developers and uploaded to the blockchain. But because the blockchain is operated by miners, if the developers die or just quit, it doesn't matter. The smart contract keeps on going without having to have the originators of that. It's pretty amazing. So what we then talk about is DeFi custody is moving from the original concept of custody. And again, I promise I did not synchronize that with peers, but those original institutions and the lovely image, was it Venice? Venetian images. Gold bars in vaults. We moved on really from 80s onwards to organizations keeping single records. They were the key custodians of data in data centers, to now us keeping private keys in custody and then acting as proxies for those transactions. So what's the future of custody? It's effectively becoming the secure web browser for every financial transaction in the future. And that's a pretty bold statement, but it's a really, really, really important one. You will be buying your mortgages in 10 to 15 years' time through these systems. You will be doing trade finance, invoice financing and so on through this, because it's simply cheaper and more secure and faster. There are many, many challenges to solve, from money laundering through to quite obscure technical issues of front-running transactions, for example, because miners have the ability to compose transactions how they wish, so they can take advantage. So this is not nirvana. There are many challenges to solve, but I think the trajectory, in my mind at least, is very clear. This is simply a technically superior solution whose logic will inescapably grind down the existing financial services, because it's simply better. This isn't ideology. This is hard facts. So, thank you so much for listening. I'm happy to field any questions if you guys got.
Any questions? Or we can save them for the panel?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. I'm super pleased that in February, March, I managed to fix my mortgage for 10 years. So in 10 years' time, I'm going to come and talk to you about the extra 5 years. Piers, you're back on again.
We've got to do a swap over, I think.
I noticed, presentation isn't quite right.
Is it all? Yeah, you can do it now. Cool.
I'll hand over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Okay. If we just break for 5 minutes whilst we sort this out, because we've got to put the new presentation on. So 5-minute break, then back for the last presentation, and then we'll do the panel. Slight technical hiccup. Okay, so this part of the talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about institutional compliance, and it's not going to be, this isn't so much going to be me explaining how these things are going to be solved. I'm just going to be posing some questions and giving some potential directions. But I think this is one of the big areas that is in being created right now for the industry. And I think there's a lot of opportunity here for people who already understand compliance, who already build financial services stacks and help people build financial services stacks to start thinking about these problems. But I think that it's an interesting area and it's going to be important to solve in the next sort of three or so years to make sure that we can build all of these financial services on top of public ledgers. So the $400 trillion question is, how can institutional money flow safely into DeFi? Because going back to this idea that the global financial system is a $400 trillion system, there's a bunch of rules around how money flows around the world. And a lot of them are very badly sort of like connected. You have different rules for different jurisdictions. Like right now, finance still is very much a local phenomenon in many ways, or a jurisdiction by jurisdiction phenomenon. And some of that is improving. As Andy said, the MiCA regulations are going to be enacted. There is more and more like desire for jurisdictional, cross-jurisdictional cooperation in this stuff. But it's sort of, I think that there is the, let's say, high risk on capital that has already flown into DeFi. And there's a bunch of sort of hedge funds and proprietary trading shops and high-risk VCs that have already sort of bought into the space. But the next part of the capital that flow in is going to be the early majority. And those people are going to want to see some more assurances, both around the regulatory frameworks as well as the ways in which they can assure themselves around AML KYC. So the problem is an interesting one. So if you remember one of the superpowers I was talking about, which is this idea of composability. So I have two applications built by two different teams, and I have a user that has capital that wants to move their capital from one application to another. And they want to do that instantaneously. Now, in the permissionless space that DeFi currently is, then a private user can do that instantly because there is no AML KYC that sort of exists in a lot of these applications. However, if you want to have a large amount of institutional capital come in, you need some framework under which you can say, this user can move capital between these two applications, and they can do so because both of the applications are comfortable with how the user has been identified, how the funds have been identified, and how the transactions are monitored. Because if you don't have that, then a lot of the sort of superpowers disappear. This ability to be able to move capital seamlessly between applications, if you start putting up barriers and you start putting up friction where you have to go through a huge amount of paperwork every time that happens, you start to see the issues. Now, the other problem is, how can the industry retain AML oversight? So in my own head, I separate sort of KYC AML into two sections. One is like identity-based KYC AML. Who is this person? How have I assured myself that I know who this person is? And do any PEPs and sanctions apply to them? And then transaction-based AML, like where is this source of wealth from, and are these funds themselves clean? I think there's some better answers to the transaction-based stuff in crypto already. I think there's some very interesting answers to that. I think that on the identity side, there's a lot of work to do still. And if we also, the reason that the AML piece is an important one is because you end up creating these pools within DeFi. And again, these pools, you need some way of being able to make sure that everyone who's put capital in those pools isn't bringing in capital that has any problems associated with it. Now, from a technology point of view, those are really easy problems to solve. Like a ledger, a smart contract, is a system of rules that is absolutely enforced according to the logic of those rules. And so saying, well, only investors from this jurisdiction are able to interact with this application. Only investors from this jurisdiction are able to put in this amount of capital. However, investors from this jurisdiction can put in this amount of capital. Only investors that have been shown to be sophisticated investors or accredited investors can put capital in. Like all of those rule sets, those are simple flags that you can apply to systems of permissions that can instantaneously be applied at a smart contract level. That's not the difficult bit. The difficult bit is how do you create a shared concept of identity, and how do you create a shared concept of AML? So one of the approaches that is being tried on public ledgers at the moment is something called, that I call gardens. I don't think anyone else calls them gardens yet, but I call them gardens. The reason I call them gardens is because they are essentially assets that you can, that have, sorry, public applications that you have to have some badge or flag or NFT against your wallet that says that you have been accredited by some institution that then allows you to interact with that application. The biggest experiment in this at the moment is called Aave Pro. So I spoke about Aave, lending and borrowing market. There's now Aave Pro, in which hedge funds and other institutional investors are able to use the same functionality of Aave, borrowing and lending, but I have assurance from the institution that is sitting in front of anyone who is bringing capital in and doing the KYB checks, the KYC checks, the AML checks on the funds that are moving into that walled garden. However, there isn't this idea of then being able to integrate that with any other application. Right? So the garden is just a single application, and that's powerful, but not as powerful as this idea of cross-composability. And a large part of this problem comes associated with how you have to do, or how everyone does KYC, AML, or a large number of people in the financial industry do AML, KYC, which is essentially we will check everything directly ourselves. So if I have a customer that is on my platform and I'm a financial institution, I need to have done sufficient due diligence to satisfy myself from my own compliance perspective that that person is not a terrorist or a politically connected person or anything like that. And the source of funds is clean. Now, there is already a concept of reliance within the industry. Like if you think about how the banking network works, there is some degree of reliance when funds move from one bank to another on one bank's regulatory perimeter and what they have to do to be able to make sure that those funds are clean, and therefore the next bank in line can rely on the first bank's regulatory perimeter. There's also stuff in things like how Visa works, if anyone knows how Visa works, and their network of money services businesses that connect into that. Again, this concept of reliance. We're relying on these entities to have conducted the checks that they need to, so we don't have to recheck all of that information again. However, that's not the norm. Most companies take a very conservative risk-based approach where they say we have to check everything ourselves, and if we haven't seen all basic information, that's a problem. The thing is that AML KYC also seems to be batting up against a bunch of issues as we go towards a more digital world, where like leaks of information, leaks of personal documentation, all of that kind of stuff is becoming more common. Actually, GDPR regulation is making companies incredibly worried about the data that they hold on their own books. And there does seem to be need to be some solution in which there can be a concept of reliance that can be more robust between companies, where there isn't the requirement to continually check every single piece of documentation yourselves before you can assure yourself that a counterparty is fine. And this idea of better protection of customer privacy and better protection of customer data, because I don't think that the industry overall does a massively great job of that. So one of the things that we've created, and this is an optional service on Radix. It's not a requirement. Everything that we build is just a tool. We don't decide what people choose to do ultimately with it. But one of the things that we were like, if compliance is coming to DeFi, and we want to make sure that the barrier to entry retains as low as possible, because ultimately the people who build, the people who built the Googles and the Facebooks of the internet age were not the beer moths of the pre-internet age. They were college students who were just sitting in their room and came up with a good idea. We have to be able to maintain, our belief is it's important to maintain that low barrier to entry, that anyone can come along and create something on these public ledgers. But you have to have the tools to be able to do that, and part of that is compliance. So one of the things that we've built as an experiment is something called Instapass. And Instapass is KYC AML for Web3. Now, a lot of people think about digital identity checking in the form that you have something like on Fido or Jumio, or where basically what you do is you send your customer to that software, they upload their passport, they tell their address, and then the system comes back and says, we've checked it, but it's up to you to decide whether or not you accept this. Right? What they do is they put the risk on they still put the risk on the company rather than allowing reliance. What we're trying to do here, and we're getting closer to it, is being able to build a system where you can say where actually a compliance officer goes through the identity and goes through the PEPs and sanctions checks, and then goes, we have checked this. We think that this can be relied on as a form of digital identity. If you have that as a service that then integrates with things like the concept of gardens, suddenly you can say, okay, well now we can say we're all relying on this particular service to say whether or not the funds that are in here are clean, and then all of these companies can then interlink because they're relying on the same thing. Now that's an interim step in my view. I think that there's a bunch of stuff that's coming down the road around what's called zero-knowledge proofs of identity checks, where you can show a certificate from an institution that has checked your identity, and you can present that as an on-ledger proof that allows you to instantly access these things. But that's coming down the road. I'd say that's probably 5 to 10 years out before that's robust enough and has enough regulatory comfort around it, because ultimately at that point there is no one that you can call upon and say, hey, the regulator's knocking, they'd like to know who that person is. Can you provide the regulator with that documentation? Again, this is something that Instapass is being built to solve. On the AML front, I think that the solutions are better. As Alex was talking about, everything on a public ledger is public. The identities of the people associated with addresses aren't, but every single transaction that occurs is. And so there's a growing area of AML, anti-money laundering, within crypto called chain analytics. And chain analytics is a tool that allows you to look at the history of any transaction that has occurred on Ledger and analyze all of the places that it's gone before. And what they tend to do is they gather information from publicly available sources and sources such as the dark web. So they'll go onto the dark web and they'll go, what are all of the addresses of all of the drug dealers? What are the crypto addresses of all of the marketplaces that are selling illicit goods? They will then look at where have all the hacks happened. They'll talk to all of the exchanges and they'll say to the exchanges, who in your system has been a bad actor? And all of that information is then gathered together in these databases that then when you put in a token transaction, you can actually see the entire history of where that transaction came to now. And that is incredibly powerful for assuring yourself around the cleanliness of the funds themselves. And if there's one thing you take away from this in terms of what can I do to better understand how blockchain and crypto works, you could do much worse than just doing a course in chain analytics, because it will help you understand not only how the technology works, it'll also help you understand the risk framework under which you can interact with crypto assets themselves as well. So chain analytics provides not just a fantastic one-time monitoring tool, the ability to say, hey, I've checked these funds, they look good, and the associated risk score with those funds. You can also do things like ongoing monitoring. You can see what is actually happening on a minute-by-minute basis within DeFi applications and things like that. So I think from a funds perspective, as in are these funds clean, there are some really good tools, and they're already emerging. From an identity-based KYC AML perspective, I still think there is a way to go. We have an hypothesis that we're experimenting with that we think is going to be a useful tool for people thinking about how they could build compliant DeFi. But I don't think that we're going to be the only experiment in that. It's just what we think is necessary to build to help kickstart other people coming in and go, yes, this is a solution I can solve, this is something I can do. But the key that I want you to take away is that identity systems are a crucial part, and compliance is going to be a crucial part of how public ledgers operate, but it has to be thought about from the point of view of the power of these systems is the ability for sharing user bases and sharing a capital base between many applications. And if you start from that perspective, rather than an individual product perspective, I think that there is going to be a lot of opportunity for unlocking the next wave of institutional DeFi. So that's all I've got to say about AML KYC. It's more questions than there are answers. If you want to find out more about Instapass, the website is instapass.io. It's not currently live, but if you are interested in experimenting with it, please do let me know. And if you are thinking about building anything in Web3, then I would love to talk to you about how you could do that on Radix as well. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Piers. Please take a seat. Could I invite my panel up, please? If you let me have that one.
Yeah.
If you want, yeah. Given the speakers have introduced themselves, that's fine. But if, Amy, I could ask you to introduce yourself. I suspect most people know who you are, but just in case.
Yep, sure. Thanks, Andy. So I'm Amy Bryant. I'm the Deputy CEO at Jersey Finance. And I also head up our strategy and research team. And from our perspective, the kind of conversation that we're having this morning, the fintech brief, all that encompasses crypto, etc., sits within that area of focus. So lovely to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Julie?
Hello, everyone. I'm Julie Keir from the Government of Jersey, fintech lead.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
OK, so I've got a few canned questions. I'm going to ask the panel, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor for any questions that you'd like to ask. Possibly directed more towards Piers and Alex. But where do you see the opportunities for DeFi and where you're seeing sort of traction? So what can you've talked actually quite a few of these, but are there any others you want to pull out?
Yeah, I mean, I think that my favorite conversation I've had recently was with a friend of mine that actually got me into cryptocurrencies. And he sort of has gone full circle around sort of going into the smart contract space, going into the DeFi space. And then he got a little disillusioned about it. We had this conversation. He said, it sometimes feels like we're building marketplaces for three-legged donkeys. And I said, yeah, that's probably true at the moment, but these are all experiments around how to build incredibly efficient marketplaces. And as you get the more assets that people actually do care about in a more macro sense in terms of outside of just the crypto bubble, those tools are going to be incredibly interesting. So I think, I've spoken about exchanging, I've spoken about lending and borrowing. There's also things like oracles that are going to allow you to do more complicated financial transactions that have trigger events that, like, what happens if the weather changes? What happens if a sports team wins? What happens if whatever? And those abilities then to bring off-ledger feeds onto Ledger are going to allow much more complicated applications. And then I think one of the biggest areas long-term for growth in DeFi, and it's already seeing traction now, is going to be derivatives. If you think about what a derivative is, it is a financial contract that describes at least a binary outcome. It can be more than just a binary outcome, but at least a binary outcome based on a trigger. And when you have that concept where you can now apply that in code that automatically clears or settles, and the instrument itself is then transferable, like, you suddenly open up an incredibly interesting set of things that can be built there. So I think derivatives are going to be an area to watch in crypto as well.
Don't want to repeat, agree with all of that. So you probably all read about kind of metaverse and all that kind of stuff. Something is rubbish or not. I was at a conference, permissionless. I'm a big skeptic of it, but there's a lot of people talking about. They said, look, here's a thought experiment. Our current economy is based on real-world physical stuff. It's constrained, therefore, to however many square kilometers of planet Earth. Metaverse can be infinite. Therefore, in principle, the metaverse can have much bigger economy than the real economy. I was like, yeah, okay, maybe, but it's kind of a stretch to think that way. But there's some validity to that. And then I was with my head of sales, and I was like, yeah, but do you really want to spend most of your time in metaverse? I guess, yeah, well, you're kind of lucky, mate. You've got a probably nice house and nice life and stuff. Most of us live in shit places, and frankly, escapism is really, really important. And I was like, yeah, that's actually true. And then you kind of add to that, look, we know, or at least there's clear evidence there's climate change. We need to do something better in terms of the amount of carbon we burn to travel. So then virtual holidays probably are going to come, yeah? The amount of stuff that we do in terms of travel right now is just not sustainable unless we find new technology to make that more sustainable. Virtual holidaying becomes more important. Okay, so once you start making those small mental leaps, then you say, well, how can virtual assets, which are just imaginary assets, be worth of any value? And then you kind of go, well, how much does a website domain cost? Well, for popular ones, millions and millions. Why? Because it's something we all go to. If you can quickly remember to type in www.blockchain.com, that's worth a lot of marketing dollars. So how is that any different if you kind of know a particular virtual space that everyone goes to because we all kind of want to hang out in that place? That's going to be worth a lot of money. So there is now kind of, if you follow that trend of thought, actually it's not that crazy to imagine that for some aspects, there'll be extremely high value virtual assets. And we've seen previous other examples where people worry about how do I have provable ownership of those assets that's not controlled by the creator of those solutions. So you get Decentralized and others now creating decentralized solutions where it's not owned by any one entity. Bruce Willis was one of the first guys who actually said, look, I've got a huge music collection. I want to give it to my son. And Apple said, well, you can't because technically you don't actually own any of your music. It's just under license. So, that $200,000 that you spend on music, yeah, well, dies with you, mate. So ownership of digital assets is actually really important and independent of the platform that provides those things. So whilst being pretty skeptical about it, I'm slowly starting to think that there will be value in virtual assets, especially as we see climate change impact our ability to live the way we used to live before, and we will need to adapt, and therefore we'll look for new experiences, and that will have its own economy. So just a little bit far out there, but it's worth thinking about.
Thank you. Thinking about crypto centers, what are the emerging or buoyant crypto centers out there today, and why do you think they're successful?
So, I mean, I can talk a little bit about the places that we're seeing emerging. So there's Dubai, Singapore, Switzerland, Malta. Obviously, there have been Portugal, and each of these jurisdictions have a slightly different reasons. Puerto Rico, all of these jurisdictions have a slightly different reason that they've started to emerge as a crypto center, and some of them were mistakes, and some of them were specifically designed. In Portugal, the government decided to pause enacting tax on crypto asset gains. And as a result, combined with their golden visa program, a lot of crypto entrepreneurs moved to Portugal. And actually, Portugal is probably the number one place that I see some of the smartest people in the industry in Europe moving to at the moment. And they moved there because of the tax break and because it was easy to get a visa. And that's already starting to see huge dividends for the ecosystem in Portugal. In Malta, they took a very deliberate decision in the same way that they did at the start of the gambling, sort of online gambling, to regulate the idea of a smart contract-based platform that could deal with money, where they basically adapted their fiduciary rules to work within a smart contracts framework, and so that it made it easier for people to decide to build ICOs and dApps out of Malta, making a direct play to try and get more of that capital coming in. And again, they had some rules associated with making sure that you had to hire someone locally. So there was a requirement to hire a Maltese staff so that you could set up these institutions, which was creating job opportunities in the island. And that's also been relatively successful. I think the downfall of Malta has been its lack of transparency and lack of consistency in how its regulation and laws are applied. And that's caused a lot of people to have a lot of frustration. So I think that while they did make the regulatory leap, they didn't make the framework clear, and they didn't make the regulatory oversight process clear. And so it's ended up with a lot of frustration. I wouldn't say that Malta's a complete success, but they'd certainly made a direct attempt. With Switzerland, the basis of Switzerland was actually the rules around foundations. So one of the things that's really complicated with a public decentralized application is that the application itself doesn't have legal personhood because it wasn't it's essentially just a piece of code that's autonomous. So how do you get rid of the idea of the unlimited liability of an individual that puts that thing in motion, and make it work as a decentralized system? And there's this weird Swiss thing that's called a foundation, which is kind of a charitable organization that has no shareholders and has no owners, and so that they were able to create the starting point. That was what the Ethereum Foundation used to launch Ethereum. When Ethereum was really successful, the FINMA, is it FINMA in Switzerland?
Yeah.
FINMA. Yeah, so FINMA then was like, okay, this is clearly an emerging market, and they've leaned in very strongly to well-run projects that are doing token issuance, where they've taken a very solid line around primary versus secondary markets, and they've basically gone, we don't really care about secondary markets. The token can be entirely transferable. We just care that the primary issuance is done correctly. And that line has meant that people have started to do tokenized equity out of Switzerland. It's actually probably going to be the first jurisdiction that's successfully doing tokenized equity because of this line between, this very clear line that they've said we only care about primary issuance. Once it's issued to the individuals, it's up to the individual's choice. And then there's a bunch of stuff that's in Switzerland that's interesting as well. Singapore has made an attempt, but actually very few companies have been approved. And Dubai is changing their licensing rules around crypto companies as well. And so you're seeing a large amount of capital and entrepreneurs going to Dubai. And ultimately, it's causing a large amount of money and talent to be flowing into these economies.
Yeah. So I think Amy sort of directed at you. I've heard Dubai, Switzerland. I talked about Cayman, Bermuda. These are all jurisdictions that JFL work in. Do you want to tell us a bit about how JFL see DeFi and sort of JFL's thoughts on this space?
Yeah, absolutely. So you've referenced a large number of kind of competitor jurisdictions there and what their approach is to crypto, to DeFi going forward. I think, firstly, actually, I'd really like to commend Radix on the conference this morning. I think the sheer number of people in the audience as well is really good to see, because it means that this is a topic that there's a lot of interest in, and I think it's important that we maintain this very clear focus on innovation. So to directly, I guess, answer your question, we see this sort of topic as sitting within the innovation sphere for Jersey Finance and for Jersey as a jurisdiction. And I think one of the things that we've got to come back to, and perhaps I'll touch on this a bit more later, is that balance between being innovative and being a kind of a leader and a front runner in these sorts of new concepts, to how we need to balance that with kind of the reputation piece that is so critical to Jersey as an international finance centre. We've got a really, really established finance industry here, which is incredibly well regulated, which has got a long history. And so we need to make sure that where we're going innovation-wise sits comfortably with that, and I think that's really, really important. But more broadly, so where does DeFi, where does crypto, where does that sit for us? I said it's within innovation. We've got a real focus at Jersey Finance on fintech. It's one of our key strategy areas for us to be focused on, and I know that it's similar within government as well, and I think that's one of the strengths of the jurisdiction, that we can bring together all of the key actors and stakeholders within a specific topic area very quickly to make agile decisions. But fintech for us as Jersey Finance has got two key lenses, key things that we look at. The first is about productivity and efficiency. How can we use financial technology to create productivity gains and efficiencies? And the second bit is about enhancing the customer experience. So we're not focused on any sort of particular technology. We're about, does what we're talking about enhance on one of those two angles? And a lot of what we've heard today, I think, goes some way to addressing some of those issues. So we've talked about the frictionless aspect of it. We've talked about cost efficiencies. We've talked this morning about things being instantaneous. So there's a lot of synergies between what we've talked about and heard from the Radix team this morning with what we want to achieve on that fintech agenda. But it's about balancing those kind of competing priorities of innovation, remaining agile, and then thinking about how that sits within our regulatory framework and within our reputation piece as well.
Cool. Thank you for that, and I look forward to paying my membership in XRD next year and out there. Julie, your background is a lawyer by trade. I know you've got extensive experience in sort of financial services, but you're relatively new to the government and the policy side. Can you give us your thoughts of what's potentially going to happen with the new Council of Ministers and your sort of thinking, or your work on your side in this area? And I know it's not quite your area, but if you've got any comments on sort of VASP and where that is, I think that would be hugely helpful to to us?
Yeah, so I'm sure many of you, or hopefully most of you that are resident in Jersey here, used your vote in the last sort of few weeks. But we saw from manifestos that were published just before the election that digitalization of the economy is sort of creeping ever more into people's kind of onto their radars. It's really important that that's carried through. It's recognised within the financial services strategy framework that we published last year. Digitalisation is one of the pillars that we really want to kind of prop up. We see it as the way forward for our financial services economy, and we've got to work with it rather than against it. And we're developing that with regards to our digital ID systems consultation, so that we can try and unlock the blockers that are currently there for financial services businesses to onboard their clients digitally. So that's a piece that we're consulting on at the moment. Consultation runs until the 30th of August, if anyone would like to submit their views on that one. And then, so we've got that running simultaneously to the VASP's work that we are doing, that the financial crime team that sit alongside the financial services unit that I'm part of. So they're obviously, it's not been VASP or virtual assets have not been regulated in Jersey really. So it's a case of they're having to assess the risks, work out what we have on island, and they're going to look to regulate that, I believe, through from an AML-CFT perspective, through the proceeds of crime law that we have on Jersey. There's an amendment coming, so that we can start to assess what work we do have, what gaps we've got, where we need to potentially look to regulate, where we want to find those opportunities, what are the high risk for us, what's low risk for us, and really sort of feel our way through it. But it's such a fast-moving area. We need to have that flexibility and agility in our legislation and our regulatory framework. But equally, like Amy says, be very mindful of the risks to exposure, reputation, and it's just getting that balance right and playing to the strengths of what we do on island already.
Yeah, great, thank you. I think I'm slightly conscious of time, and I'm really keen that people in the audience get the opportunity to ask a question. So we've got a couple of mics running around. Would anybody like to ask?
Probably be heard if you.
Yeah.
We're talking about the Jersey reputation as one solid unit. Can we not sort of say that there's an internet space or blockchain space or DeFi space, and separate them two out rather than sort of saying there's just one unit as a reputation?
Shall I pick up that first? Yeah, I mean it's a good point. We've got. We've got one economy, but within that we've got lots of different sectors, and there's a space for the more innovative, the more risky areas, if you like, to surge forward. I think from a reputation perspective, though, we're talking about DeFi here in the context very much of financial services and how we can use it to evolve the traditional financial services industry that we've got here. And so I do think that there's very much a connection between the two from a reputation perspective. And what that means is that if there was to be a situation where something affected something in the DeFi space, as we're talking about that this morning, was to cause us a reputational issue. As a small jurisdiction, reputation is absolutely critical, and the wider world doesn't differentiate so much between what might happen in one sector and the knock-on effect for the economy and the island as a whole. So I think there's a connection, and I think maybe Julie, you might want to touch on the fact that this would be something that would be very much within our sort of the Moneyval purview.
Yeah.
So if we're thinking about regulation and the assessments that we have as a jurisdiction on the global scene, Moneyval for us is an assessment that is happening. It happens every sort of 5 years or so. We've got one that will run into next year, and this is something that they will be looking at intently. The VASP's work that is ongoing at the moment is very much a response to that, and is something that will be looked at when they come in. So I think innovation is absolutely critical, but reputation is something that kind of sits, in my view anyway, sits above that, and there are always these sort of interdependencies and a knock-on and a ripple effect sometimes.
I think, yeah, for Jersey it's very hard to sort of separate the two out really, because it is so essential to underpinning our greater economy on the island. So,
Thank you.
Hi there, John Palou, Arrow Global. My question's really about, I suppose, the view of DeFi as the democratization of finance globally. And if that is true, then my question is really, how does Jersey and other jurisdictions regulate this space when it gets down to the retail customer? It's quite easy to talk about institutions and accredited investors, et cetera, and I think we all kind of know that space, but what happens when you go down to the democratization kind of layer?
Probably pick that one up in the sense that it's, from a policy perspective and from our perspective, customer protection will be super important. You can't ignore that. It's something that we know is an evolving space, and accessibility and inclusivity of DeFi is going to, it's key to enabling this to grow and reach those retail customers, but we've equally got to protect those retail customers, and education will play a massive piece in that, as well as policy development within government, within the regulator, to make sure that we can protect as much as we're able, given it is such a fast-moving piece.
I think if I could, oh, sorry.
Please go ahead.
Okay, no, I was just going to supplement that by saying at the moment, obviously, if we think about the finance industry that we have here in Jersey, it's very much an international finance industry and very much catering towards that professional investor, sophisticated investor, institutional investor audience and market. And so I think that's why it was a really, really interesting conversation that we had this morning, Piers, that you touched on, and indeed yourself, just around the fact that actually that's where this DeFi space is moving into much more, and actually for it to be successful going forward, it's got to be attractive to the institutional market and the institutional investor. So at a retail level, consumer protection, etc., absolutely critical, but for DeFi to really take off, it's got to be attractive to an institutional market, and really great to hear some of the developments in that space this morning, I think. Sorry, and I spoke over.
So, no, I mean, obviously, I don't know much about specifics of Jersey, but in the UK, wider, you do have crowdfunding, crowd lending, which the reason I mention that is it gives us a pathway to think about how we give exposure for much higher risk assets to the retail space. Of course, the other thing to remember, we do allow gambling. So, how much protection do we want to give? Because if you allow people to gamble all of their life savings, then frankly, why are we being so protective about people gambling on kind of crypto when it's okay to blow all your cash on a horse? That to me, honestly, I just don't get it.
I think we had a question from a gentleman at the back.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much. What's happening in the educational part of the DeFi space? Because it seems that the bottleneck is people, as you've sort of pointed out. And what's happening, we see a lot of money going into marketing in the space, but how much is actually being pumped into education?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and the answer is surprisingly little. It's something that Radix is investing heavily in. We do a lot of webinars, we do a lot of hackathons, we do a lot of code competitions and tutorials. We also, in our community, there's lots of people who organize learn to code things together and things like that. And I think that's going to be essential. I think that the next stage of this is going to be what we're already seeing in the web space. So if you're familiar with things like Founders and Coders or with Code Academy, these courses that are set up where at the end of the course there is job opportunities, and you'll do a 3-month training course to learn to be, at the moment it's a web developer. That's normally the thing that you do. 3-month course, 2-month course, very intense. Take people who've never coded before, 2 months, 3 months, then they have a job at the end of it if they do well in the course. I think things like that are going to be essential for the Web3 space as well. I think there's definitely a space for someone to do that in Jersey. If Jersey is going to be a jurisdiction that is going to lead digitization, let alone DeFi, then you guys really need to increase the number of people who are code competent in Jersey. The thing that I didn't talk about in the presentation, but I think is so interesting about new area and emerging areas, is that there is so much green space, white space, whatever you want to call it, of low-hanging fruit of things that can be created. If you look at any DeFi application, at core, it's actually incredibly simple. They're often no more than a few thousand lines of code. If you compare that to a typical web stack today, it's incredibly complicated. So the ability to take someone from interested to competent in a short space of time, right now, there's actually a huge amount of scope for doing that. And the more that is sort of like that educational effort is pushed forwards, I think the more advantages places are going to have, because as you've seen, there's only 18,500 full-time of these people globally. And so I think there's a huge opportunity, and education should be invested in more, something we're doing, but it should be a wider community effort as well.
That is something that's happening through the work with Digital Jersey and the digital apprenticeship scheme as well that the government's launching. So it is things that we are trying to work on and are aware of that, we do need to bolster our sort of digital skills.
But I think that the real challenge in blockchain as well is that it's multidisciplinary. It's not only just about being able to code. You have to do so in a very secure way. And a developer who can code with security in mind is actually much rarer than a developer who can just cut some code. And then, of course, your focus is on building a toolkit where it's effectively a domain-specific language for finance, which means that the developers have to actually also have relatively good understanding of the finance principles as well. So now you're mixing somebody who understands basic finance, security, and coding. That Venn diagram is extremely small. And it was interesting a few years ago, I was in Brussels giving evidence, and when I was still at UBS, and this old gentleman goes, look, it's all very nice about code transparency. He goes, how many people do you think understand fully how blockchain works and cryptography? Probably 50 in the world, properly. And he goes, so you kind of asking me to trust the entire financial services to 50 people in this world, not to screw me over? That's the point.
Yeah, but you could say, the most popular operating system in the world is Linux, and that's built by one person.
Yeah, I know. But education is really important, because if we create a cult of computer scientists, we simply transfer power from finances to coders. Now, frankly, I'm all up for that, but it still creates a systemic risk. So I think education is critical to decentralize that risk.
Yeah.
Okay, I am very mindful of time, so a couple of more questions. There's a lady, I know. Or if you're happy, we can stay a bit longer and we can ask more questions.
So I'm asking for a friend who couldn't make it today. For me and Julie, what are the Jersey initiative if, like my friend is running a DeFi protocol right now, want to move to Jersey, what are our current initiative? And maybe Pierre, you can testify why did you choose Jersey?
Yeah, I think Andy started with a great question, which is around what are when we talk about competitors, what is it that attracts somebody to a jurisdiction in this space? And I think it's about having the right enabling environment. And so I think that's something that Jersey has got a good story to tell around. As I said earlier, the fact that we've got, don't want to point at them, but we have got somebody from the regulator in the audience today. We've got the government and we've got the industry represented in the room today. Means that we can be quite agile and nimble in our decision making. I think if you've got somebody who's very interested in, perhaps relocating either themselves or their business to the island, and it's very particularly in the digital space, specifically in the DeFi space, the person you really need to talk to is sitting 2 lines in front of you, and that's Ed. So Ed, just wave your hand a little bit. Ed works at Digital Jersey, and he is able to. There's a scheme there that is able to support ensuring the right business licensing and visa applications, etc. So I'd link up with him afterwards. But I think we've got a compelling story to tell when it comes to encouraging that, and we've got a great story here because Radix are in Jersey. So it's a tried and tested route, is what I would say. But follow up with Ed. Thank you.
So, hi.
Good morning, everybody. Firstly, thanks for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. My question is whether anybody on the panel has had discussions with sort of big government, some of the major regulators, and what their views on on DeFi is I would imagine that they are quite happy controlling the money supply and the credit creation process that exists in the sort of current status quo, and certainly what has been explained or talked about this morning is the polar opposite. It's a moving away from that. So my gut feeling is there might be quite a lot of resistance from the major governments, the major regulators, and just very interested in what your views are on that.
Yeah, I mean, I can give my brief view and then let you guys have a. So I think that I think there's often the idea that the current system is antithetical in terms of how it could be implemented versus a public ledger. You can do everything that you can do in the current system on public ledger. There's often a question as why would you? And from the point of view of a government, what's the purpose of a government? The government is there to facilitate the GDP of an economy. Now, one of the things that I mean, there's nuances to that, but I think that's one of the key functions of government. And the ability, let's say that you are the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and your entire economy is digitized, and now you have a full real-time view of the entire functionality and quality of your economy. And when every time you pull a lever of money supply or something like that, you get to see real time how that's behaving in your economy. I think that's pretty exciting. Suddenly you have a Jeff Bezos-like view over your Amazon empire, but from a government point of view. There's also the fact that if you have government-issued currencies on top of a public ledger, there's nothing stopping that government-issued currency not having all of the controls that you currently have on the currency, how it's issued, whether or not it's recallable, whether or not it's freezable, whether or not you can stop transfers to people that you don't want. All of those things are just rule sets that you apply on top of a ledger. So what I've seen from the governments that we've spoken to, be that the European Union, people in the European Union, be that people out in Asia, is that governments are very interested in digitizing their economy, not only because it gives them a more clarity on what their tax basis is, like ultimately this does come down to tax a lot of the time, it also gives them immense power to be able to see what is happening in their economy as well. Plus, it gives them the ability to speed up business. So going from T+7 or T+5 to T0 is actually a massive improvement in many areas of finance that exist today. And that all greases the wheels for GDP, and that all increases the capital allocation efficiency of the country. So yeah, I think there's lots of reasons that governments like it.
And not that I have spoken to governments, but this is my pure view. Ultimately, it doesn't matter what the governments want to do, it matters what the people want to do. Anglo-Saxons tend to lean towards small government, and actually fiat manipulation is an antithesis to that. Frankly, we should be removing the ability, in my opinion, for the government to mess with money supply and let kind of people who actually are driving the economy manage that. That's a small government view. So then you kind of say, oh my gosh, how the hell do you then manage the economy? Well, actually, we still have the levers for wealth redistribution, which is called taxation. Look at quantitative easing. Again, this is a personal view. Basically, it was an increase in tax because they increased the money supply and gave it to random people. We don't know who they gave it to. There was no consultation. There was no discussion about effectively raising taxes and who is going to be subsidized. It was just done behind closed doors. On bonds that are 30 years old, which means probably 90% will default, and people will frankly walk away with cash in their pocket that was taken out of my pocket. I detest that. I think if you want to redistribute wealth, I'm all up for that. I think we need to look out for people who can't look after themselves. But do it honestly, have a clear discussion, increase the taxes temporarily, and redistribute. Quantitative easing is an easy way out to frankly screw a load of people. So the less the government has control to manipulate money supply, the better. So that's kind of my view, but I think voters will increasingly recognize that and will push governments to renegade their ability to manipulate money supply.
Okay. Well, one more question, then we'll draw for the Lambo. This is gentleman.
How much of our
where do I go to learn your new language, your new smart?
On our website, radixdlt.com, and then there's a developer. Just sign up for the developer and they get loads of everything that you need, basically, will be in there. Christoph, if you want to have a chat to us after, by the way, we'll be here. Do you want? No, okay. We'll be here to talk. Christoph, do you have?
The draw. I would highly appreciate it if everyone would fill out the survey when they're leaving.
And Christoph's had a random number generator, so he can tell us who's won the Lego Lambo. I did have, he's left, so I can tell you, I did have a gentleman who's quite senior in a bank, and he said to me, Andy, how on earth have you funded a Lambo? I said, it's there, Lego. I won't embarrass him.
Well, this is tense.
Yeah, there's 6 winners picked so far, so we'll start from the top one. He's drawing. Okay, so the first one is Craig Marrett. Oh. Woo. Enjoy it, Craig. Thank you very much for your attendance, everybody.